Hey everyone, it's Noam here. I've got super exciting news to share with you that I've been bursting to announce, and I've finally gotten the green light. Unpacking Israeli History is hitting the road. That's right. We're going to be doing live episodes of Unpacking Israeli History across the United States. First stop, drumroll please, Chicago. Mark your calendars now for the first ever live episode in Chicago on June 8th with a very special guest. It's going to be amazing. Follow Unpacking Israeli History on Instagram and sign up for our newsletter at unpacked.media/subscribe to be the first to know when tickets go on sale. That's unpacked.media/subscribe. And hey, if you're not in Chicago, you can fly in. But if you're not in Chicago for real, don't worry. We're going to be announcing more live shows in other cities soon, so stay tuned. Very exciting. Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode of Unpacking Israeli History is generously sponsored by Andrea and Larry Gill, Jody and Ari Storch, and the Marcus Family Foundation. If you are interested in sponsoring an episode of Unpacking Israeli History or just saying what's up, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. Before we start, one more thing. As of just recently, we're also on Instagram and YouTube. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. Just go to Unpacking Israeli History. Any of those places, as I say, yalla, let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
You all know I love to start these episodes with a story, usually something comical or self-deprecating or slightly absurd. Something that reveals some facet of my personality, my love of carbs, my hatred of / discomfort with board games, my family's totally normal and healthy obsession with sports, tiny reminders that I have an identity beyond talking about Israel. But the story I'm about to tell you bucks all of that. It's absurd, but it isn't comical. And it's a little peek into who I am, who I'm married to, and a demonstration of the fact that the boundaries between my job and my identity, my core self, can be porous. Sometimes it's hard to know where Noam the person ends and Noam the educator begins. This is one of those times. Last year, my wife, Razy, barged into my office. "I have to tell you a story," she said. "You need to hear this." Razy was a few days out from a mission trip to Israel. She had just called our health insurance company and let them know she'd be traveling abroad. The woman on the other end of the phone asked where she was going. A few years ago, that question might not have been fraught. Today, it's a gamble. But Razy told the truth. She was bracing for some acerbic comment at worst. Instead, she got an unexpected outpouring of sympathy. "I'm just so sad about Israel," the health insurance agent said. "My son is in high school, and he just told me that he wants Palestine to be free from the river to the sea. He meant free from Jews." Let me remind you of this. This was a routine call to our health insurance company. Razy wasn't expecting a hot-button political conversation, but the woman wasn't done. She told Razy that she had asked her son, "What do you know about the history of the Jews? Do you know they come from Judea, from Israel? Do you know that just 80 years ago, 1/3 of the world's Jews were wiped out? By the way, what did you learn about the Holocaust in school?" And her son responded, "Huh?" Because he had never heard of the Holocaust. I'll say that again. He didn't know any of this. At this point, by the way, Razy was captivated. Her administrative errand had turned into something much, much bigger. The health insurance agent was enraged. There aren't a whole lot of Jews where she lives, but that, she said, was no excuse. So she called up the school principal and let him have it. By the way, this is all on a phone call about insurance. How dare my son be left ignorant of one of the most systemized genocides in the history of the world? How can he learn about World War II and yet know nothing about the mechanized slaughter of 1 in 3 of the world's Jews? How dare you? She finished her tirade to the principal. Meaning, how dare you keep these kids ignorant? How dare you erase this from the curriculum? But the principal was unfazed by her anger. "Ma'am," he told her, "we don't teach the Holocaust because," and this is the insane part. I haven't said the insane part yet. This is it. This is the part that shocked her and Razy and me. This is what the principal said. Historians dispute whether the Holocaust actually happened. We teach verified history, not historical disputes. Razy told me all this frantically. Can you believe it? Her tone implied. What is this messed up, crazy timeline we're living in? My wife, after all, is a grandchild of survivors. But I said nothing. I was too busy processing, and I guess I was stunned. And Razy, feeling urgent and frantic and beyond herself, yelled, not at me, but to me, in anguish and hope. She said, do something about it. I've been turning the story around in my head ever since. On one level, it's unfathomable to me that anyone in this country doesn't know the story of the Holocaust, especially when I think back to my own childhood as a Jewish kid in the Baltimore suburbs. Nearly everyone I know has a Holocaust story, an aging relative who fled, who was secreted away by kind neighbors or nuns, who fled to the forest to join the resistance, surviving on berries and bark and defiance. And then there are the ones who were sent into the inferno of Auschwitz or Majdanek or Sobibor and somehow emerged alive. My elementary school teacher from Rambam in Baltimore, Moriyafa Monk, was a survivor herself. As an 8-year-old, I remember feeling like she was from another time, another world. In a way, she was. And yet, she was also just my friend's grandma, a normal bubby like anyone else's. These were the contradictions we lived with as Jewish kids. The Holocaust was right there, a shadow none of us could shake. And yet, at the same time, we were so normal and suburban. We watched cartoons and played sports and ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with the crust cut off, always cut off. Now I like crust, by the way. And we knew in detail how evil human beings can be to one another. We knew that just a few decades before we were born, someone had succeeded in slaughtering a third of us. We knew that the fact that we were here at all was in some ways a miracle. Those are heavy things for 8-year-olds to know. We didn't have the language as kids to describe the nightmares that seemed to rite a passage among people of my generation. Today we'd call it, inherited trauma or intergenerational trauma. We could probably talk about epigenetics. But back then we knew it as an occasional bad dream about uniformed men in shiny boots, or of hiding in cramped rooms, of needing to stay very, very quiet, of being told, pack your bag, you're leaving home in an hour. We'd even talk about it sometimes casually, like this was a normal conversation to have. What would you bring with you? Or really, really, really dark questions like, this is what we spoke of, so I'm sharing it with you. Which of us would have the skill sets to survive and which wouldn't? Like it was about skill sets, right? Come on. But as we got older, under every casually macabre conversation, every joke we cracked to offset the horror ran a hidden current of defiance. If the Holocaust was the darkness gathering in the corners, then we were the lights that would banish it. Every Shabbat, every holiday, every bar mitzvah, wedding, birth, bris, every trip to Israel, word of Torah, Nobel Prize, every moment felt like an act of defiance, laughing in the face of death. Except, of course, when we aren't laughing at all, when we put aside the gallows humor for a day and just remember. A day when we let the pain in, let the grief sit with us. A day when we give history our full attention. On the Gregorian calendar, that day usually falls sometime in April. In the Jewish calendar, it's the 27th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, 5 days after the end of Passover. In Hebrew, we call it Yom HaShoah HaGevurah, literally the day of the Holocaust and the Heroism, though it's usually shortened to just Yom HaShoah, Holocaust. It's got an even bulkier title in English, Holocaust and Ghetto Uprising Remembrance Day, a day of perpetual remembrance for the House of Israel. For the record, I've never heard anyone refer to it by its full English name. Too many syllables. I've been observing Yom HaShoah my whole life. In the diaspora, the rituals are more or less the same. The lighting of 6 candles, one for each of the 6 million Jewish victims, the prayers for the dead, Kaddish, and Kel Malei Rachamim. That's a prayer. A talk from a Holocaust survivor or a Holocaust movie or a visit to a museum. Some communities wear pins that read simply Zachor, the Hebrew word for remember. It's an imperative, a command. In Israel, there's another ritual of remembering. On the 27th of Nisan at precisely 10 in the morning, an air raid siren sounds throughout the country. It's alarming if you aren't used to it, that looping, plaintive whine. It's alarming even if you are. And it's also astonishing. A sudden silence descends on a country that is rarely quieter still. Cars pull over on the road, in cafes and supermarkets, in libraries and auditoriums, at the dog park and on the beach. Everyone stops what they are doing and just stands. 2 minutes of somber reflection, 2 minutes of quiet, heads bowed. The only sound is the siren and the air, the rustling of tree leaves, a sniffle, a dog barking at the siren, the white noise of everyday life without a single word. And then it ends. People get back in their cars and drive away. Baristas finish making lattes. Librarians check out books. Teachers resume their lessons. Life goes on. And I took all of this for granted until I didn't, until I started to wonder how Yom HaShoah, the HaGevurah, even came to be. Judaism, sadly, has no shortage of solemn days. Remembrance is knit into our religion, into the rhythm of our calendar. We fast to commemorate ancient tragedies, the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, the breaching of Jerusalem's walls, the high-profile assassination of an ancient Jewish governor by another Jew. And then there's the most important fast of all, besides Yom Kippur, the 9th of Av, 25 hours without food or water in the dog days of summer, to commemorate the destruction of both holy temples, first by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, then by the Romans 500 years later in the year 70. I'm not giving you those dates because I'm nitpicky and pedantic, although, of course, I am often both of those things. I'm including those dates to point out something really important about Judaism and Jews. We've been commemorating historical catastrophes, by the way, that's really what the word Shoah means, for 2,000 years. Remembering is baked into our peoplehood. In instituting this date of mourning, our ancient rabbis rolled the commemoration of every Jewish tragedy into a single day. We use Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, to remember the Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, the Crusades, the pogroms. And whether or not the Second Temple was destroyed on the exact day as the First Temple, we roll it all together. And now October 7th, the Talmud makes it clear. Huchbelu bo kol hatzarot. We subsume the major tragedies under one day. And when you think about it, that makes sense. The empires that destroyed the temples also murdered many thousands of Jews, hauling many more into captivity and exile. So Tisha B'Av isn't just about the destruction of a building, no matter how sacred. It also commemorates the loss of a homeland, the land of Israel, by the way, of autonomy and self-rule. It's the story of empires trying to sever the roots of the Jewish people from the Jewish land. Historically, most of the Jewish people's tragedies followed from there. Would the Spanish Inquisition have happened if the Jewish people had been governing themselves in their ancient homeland? How about the endless pogroms, killing tens of thousands that punctuated Jewish life in exile? What about the Holocaust? But the Holocaust is a contemporary tragedy, and the Jewish people practice an ancient religion. So how exactly did Yom HaShoah, the HaGevurah, come about with its solemn rituals of remembrance? Or to word it differently, what was the process by which the Jewish state began to reckon with the aftermath of genocide? The Jews who would later become Israelis began commemorating the Holocaust almost as soon as it happened. Religious communities adopted an existing fast day, the 10th of Tevet, in the dregs of winter, as a grim anniversary of sorts, and we'll get back to that later. But secular communities chose the 27th of Nisan, right after Passover, and Israel's parliament, the Knesset, made it official in 1951, just essentially 3 years after the state was founded. Why then? For that matter, why not January 27th? That's the day the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, and it's the day the rest of the world has adopted as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And what's with the name that the Knesset chose? Why Holocaust and Heroism Day? The answer to all these questions lies in the story of two Jewish heroes that some of you may know, some of you may not, but both are named Mordechai. One died before his 25th birthday in a cramped bunker at 18 Mila Street in Warsaw. I've been there 7 times. The other lived a full, if painful, life, serving in the parliaments of 2 countries before his death at the age of 83 in Tel Aviv. The two Mordechais never met, but both shaped the legacy of Yom HaShoah, the HaGevurah. But to understand why, I have to tell you something that never gets easier for me to talk about. And that is the way many early Israelis viewed Holocaust survivors. We've talked before about the early Zionist conception of the new Jew, a heroic pioneer, bronzed and brawny, who would muck out the swamps and plant orchards and never know the terror of a pogrom. A Jew with an iron spine, who held his ground and won, who wouldn't have just gone quietly into the trains and crematoria, who would have resisted. In fact, for some early thinkers, the new Jew wouldn't be a Jew at all. As the early Zionist writer Micha Yosef Berdichevsky put it, we will either be the last Jews or the first Hebrews. Some of them wanted to sever themselves from Jewish history in order to forge this new identity. The 140,000 survivors who poured into Israel in the years after the Holocaust, scarred and skeletal, were an embarrassing reminder that the new Jew was a little more than a fantasy, an airbrushed version of the Jew minus all the diaspora baggage. Instead of pity or compassion, survivors aroused mingled shame and disdain. Their tattoos were grotesque. Their stories were worse. No one wanted to hear them. And so they kept their testimony locked behind their lips. They didn't speak about what they suffered, and for a time, Israelis took comfort in this silence. As long as everyone was quiet, Israelis could pretend that they, brawny Hebrews that they were, would have been stronger or smarter or more defiant, that they would have survived. Maybe you're horrified by this cruel and casual dismissal of Holocaust survivors. On paper, it is horrifying, but the reality is more complicated. Remember, in the first year since its founding, Israel had fought its war of independence, which they called the War of Liberation. They'd lost 1% of the population to 5 invading armies and a handful of irregular militias. They knew the stakes, win or die, and they had won. They had won. Holocaust survivors, by the way, many of whom participated in this war of independence, were an inconvenient and painful reminder of what happens to a Jew who doesn't. A reminder that sometimes there is no winning. The Nazis had mechanized death, and there was no outsmarting the machine. Escape was a matter of luck. The crematoria didn't distinguish between a Jew who went quietly and a Jew who raised hell. It didn't matter in the end how much someone resisted. The ovens were built for all the Jewish people. Let me say it more personally. The ovens were built for me, for us all. To admit that is to admit you are vulnerable, that your fate is not in your hands. But it would take at least a decade for Israelis to confront this fact, to recognize that the line between the muscular new Jew, the Nordau new Jew, and the skeletal survivor was much, much thinner than anyone wanted to believe. Few Israelis wanted to confront the reality of the Holocaust. Everyday acts of resistance weren't glamorous. No one wanted to think about the bravery it took to smuggle food into the ghetto because no Israeli wanted to think much about the ghettos. Thinking about it meant admitting that the ghetto was built for you too. It meant admitting that if you had been there, you probably would not have survived. So no one wanted to honor the defiance it took to educate the next generation, or to start an archive documenting ghetto life, or to simply keep breathing. Because the point of a Jewish state was to break free of subjugation. And if Israelis admitted that simply staying alive for another day was a form of resistance, they would be plunged back into the world they had worked so hard to remake. A world in which a Jewish life didn't matter to anyone. A world that allowed 6 million Jews to be burned to ash. They refused to go back to a world that rewarded this quiet, heroic resistance with utter indifference. They were Israelis now. They spoke the language of power, of military might, of the ability to be a subject, not an object. They gravitated towards Holocaust stories that featured a specific kind of power, a narrow brand of resistance that fit with their own narratives about themselves. And the most famous, appealing, historically resonant of these stories was the tragic tale of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising led by our first Mordechai, a young, charismatic hero named Mordechai Anilevich. He is the reason we commemorate Yom HaShoah HaGevurah on the 27th of Nisan in springtime, right after Passover. Let's take a break, and I'll tell you all about him when we get back.
Hey, Unpacking Israeli History listeners, it's Jonathan Schwab, host of Jewish History Nerds with my friend and colleague Gal Steiner.
We are so excited to announce that we're back for our 4th season. Every week, we nerd out on a fascinating topic from Jewish history.
We're not historians, but we are fired up about learning. In Jewish History Nerds, we share our passion for Jewish history with each other and with you.
This season, we're focusing on symbols and objects, all with amazing stories and meaning. So join us for new episodes every Thursday. I promise you will learn something new.
Whoever said history was boring clearly never heard these stories. Subscribe to Jewish History Nerds wherever you get your podcasts and check out Unpacked.media.
Mordechai Anilevich was born in Poland in 1919 to a working-class Jewish family. As a teen, he joined Beitar, the revisionist Zionist youth group that had attracted future Israeli luminaries like Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. The movement was deeply concerned with Jewish dignity, which meant, in part, Jewish self-defense. Beitar's central thesis, Jews deserve self-rule in their ancestral homeland, and they would fight for it if necessary. In Hebrew, this principle was called Hadar. But Mordechai never got to see his ancestral homeland. He was 20 when the Nazis invaded Poland. He was arrested at the Romanian border trying to open an escape route towards Palestine, which is what the land of Israel was called then. After spending time in a Soviet jail, he returned to Warsaw less than a year before the Nazis began building the largest ghetto in Europe. In October of 1940, the Nazis shunted every Jew in Warsaw and the surrounding areas into the ghetto, which they sealed off from the outside world, 450,000 people squeezed into a little over 1 mile. Put differently, more than 30% of the city's population crammed into less than 3% of the city's landmass. A year later, the Nazis announced that any Jew caught outside the ghetto without valid papers would be shot on sight. It was a miserable place without adequate food, sanitation, or infrastructure. Its residents were crowded 6 or 7 to a single room, subsisting on 200 calories a day. It's basically just an apple with a tablespoon of peanut butter. That's what it is. They faced arbitrary arrest, detention, and forced labor, as well as starvation and disease. Over the course of 2 years, more than 80,000 Jews died there. And that was before mass deportations to the extermination camp at Treblinka in 1942. And Levitch quickly established himself as a leader of the ghetto's resistance. He established a newspaper called Neged HaZerem, which means countercurrent. At first, he confined his resistance to cultural activities, to sneaking out of the ghetto to coordinate anti-Nazi resistance movements in other cities. It was during one of these covert visits in the summer of 1942 that the Nazis deported 265,000 Jews from the ghetto to Treblinka. Nerd Corner alert. In what seems like a grisly coincidence, the deportations began on the eve of Tisha B'Av, the Jewish day of mourning. Though, of course, for many people this is not a coincidence at all, but proof of a divine hand at work. Instead of trying to flee and save himself, Mordechai rushed back to the ghetto to convince its leaders that it was time to fight back. Community leaders known as the Judenrat were deeply conflicted, terrified that armed resistance would only make things worse. But Mordechai was not the only one raring to fight. Most of the people deported or murdered on the spot were parents, children, the elderly, the infirm. The 60,000 or so Jews who remained were mostly teenagers, newly orphaned and racked with guilt and shame for surviving. They knew that they were probably going to die, but they refused to go down without a fight. Mordechai was the obvious choice to lead them. And so, with a number of other young people, he organized the... Oh God, I apologize in advance for how I'm going to mangle this. Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, or more easily, ZOB, which translates to Jewish Fighting Organization, which prepared to give the Nazis hell. In the cramped warrens of the ghetto, they constructed bunkers. They made contact with the black market and the Polish Home Army, which managed to spare a few rifles and grenades. And they learned to make weapons, including crude explosives like Molotov cocktails. So when the Nazis entered the ghetto in January of 1943, the ZOB was ready. A handful of young fighters, men and women alike, met the SS with rifles and grenades. For 4 days, the SS and the malnourished resistance fighters of the ZOB fought rough and nasty street battles. 50 SS officers were killed in the uprising, but so were all the ZOB fighters, except for Mordechai. Still, the revolt was, in its bleak way, a success. The SS withdrew. The resistance had managed to fend them off and to stop a mass deportation. For a few months, the Nazis strategized. They tried to lure Jews out of the ghetto with promises of food or jobs, but the remaining Jews weren't having it. They knew where those boxcars were going. They refused to be taken alive. So, weak and half-starved, surviving a little more than spite, they gathered their strength and waited for the Nazis to return. They did, and this time they came with 2,000 soldiers, a battalion of tanks, and canisters of poison gas. April 19th, 1943 was the eve of Passover, a holiday that celebrates Jewish liberation. It also happened to be Hitler's birthday. The Nazis were master propagandists, acutely aware of the power of image. They chose this date for a reason. But the 700 Jews who met them at the gates of the ghetto were ready for the fight. Instead of crowding around a Seder table, recounting the story of the Exodus, they were gathered with guns and grenades. This year, they would not celebrate liberation. They would fight for it, knowing full well they were going to die. When Jews talk about freedom, they're usually not talking about death. To me, to us, freedom is life. It's living how you want, worshiping as you please, standing in dignity. But in April of 1943, the fighters of the ZOB redefined liberation. This year, freedom meant choosing your death. It meant refusing to be loaded onto boxcars or pressed into forced labor. It meant dying with a gun in hand, maybe taking a Nazi or two down with you. The initial battle was fierce. At first, the ZOB forced the Germans into retreat, killing or wounded 12 Nazis. For more than a week, they fought with such holy rage that the Nazis decided it would be easiest to simply raze the ghetto to the ground, killing as many of its inhabitants as they could. On May 8, 1943, Mordechai Analevich was in the ZOB headquarters, a bunker under 18 Mila Street, with roughly 100 other fighters. All around them, civilians were surrendering, but the ZOB held fast. They knew this was it. Hastily, Mordechai scribbled a letter to his friend and fellow fighter Yitzhak Zuckerman, which read in part, "Peace be with you, my dear friend. Who knows whether we shall meet again? My life dream has now been realized. Jewish self-defense in the ghetto is now an accomplished fact. I have been witness to the magnificent, heroic struggle of the Jewish fighters. Shortly afterwards, the Nazis gassed their bunker, killing Mordechai and most of his comrades. Those who didn't die immediately took their own lives to evade capture. Again, sometimes liberation means choosing the way you die. And still the ZOB limped on for another 8 days. The Nazis wouldn't declare victory over the Warsaw Ghetto until May 16th, deporting most of the remaining Jews to forced labor and concentration camps, though some Jews miraculously evaded deportation and continued the fight against the Nazis elsewhere. Which means that it took nearly a month for 2,000 Nazis to declare victory over 700 starving Jews. This is the same amount of time it took all of Poland to surrender to the Nazi invasion in September of 1939. And if you begin counting in January 1943, when the ZOB first drove away the Nazis, then the Warsaw Ghetto resistance managed to hold off Nazi forces for 5 months. 5 months! For a force of less than 1,000 young people weakened from years of starvation and disease and grief to hold off an army that had captured Poland in 27 days and France in 6 weeks. So, of course, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising became a legend in Israel and across the Jewish world. How could it not? This was the fighting spirit. This was the new Jew. The ZOB were the sons of King David, aiming their stones at Goliath's head. They were the children of the Maccabees, fending off an empire with lightning attacks. They were the descendants of the Jewish forces who had fought the Romans not once but 3 times. They were the legendary fighters of Masada, who held out on a mountain fortress for 3 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, eventually killing themselves rather than being taken captive by the Romans. And they were the inspiration for other uprisings and other ghettos and death camps. Even before the war was over, Jewish communities in the free world began to commemorate the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And that is why the Knesset chose the 27th of Nisan to mark Yom HaShoah HaGevurah. This wasn't the day the uprising began. That was the eve of Passover, not really appropriate or practical for National Holocaust Memorial Day. Instead, they picked a date sandwiched between the end of Passover and Israeli Independence Day, even though it's during the month of Nisan, which is supposed to be a month that is exclusively about positivity and happiness. But the resonance is obvious. Most of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters never made it to the IDF, but they fought with the same ethos to protect the Jewish people, to resist annihilation, to build a new world in which Jewish lives mattered. So of course Israelis don't commemorate Yom HaShoah on January 27th like the rest of the world. Sure, the liberation of Auschwitz is momentous and important and worthy of celebration, but it was a liberation at the hand of a foreign army. And Yom HaShoah HaGevurah, like Israel itself, is dedicated to Jews who rose up to defend themselves. Of course, where there are 2 Jews, there are 3 opinions. Not everyone was thrilled about marking Yom HaShoah on the 27th of Nisan. As I mentioned earlier, some deeply religious communities had been marking Holocaust Day on the 10th of Tevet in winter, the day the Babylonians laid siege to Jerusalem. And this brings us to our second Mordechai, a deeply religious Jew himself, Rabbi Mordechai Nurak, who in 1951 was a member of Knesset representing the religious Zionist Mizrahi Party, which he co-founded in 1902. Rabbi Nurak was born right as the modern Zionist movement was getting off the ground. By the time he was 19, he was an active Zionist, even attending the Sixth Zionist Conference in 1903. His interest in politics stretched beyond Zionism. Before the Holocaust, he had served in the Latvian parliament in all of his spare time. That's a joke, by the way. He was also Latvia's chief rabbi. In 1940, the Soviets annexed Latvia. As you might know from previous episodes, the USSR had a, shall we say, complicated relationship with Zionism. They deported Nurak to a re-education camp in the east, ironically saving his life. He was in Central Asia when the Nazis invaded in the summer of 1941. His wife and children, however, were still in Latvia. They were among the 75% of Latvian Jews murdered by the Nazis. Rabbi Nurak was now alone. When the war ended, he was already in his 60s, a widower, a bereaved father, a survivor of Soviet prison. He had every reason to give up. But like so many survivors, he didn't. Instead, he moved to Israel, serving in the first 5 Knessets. As a politician, he was deeply involved in every piece of Holocaust-related legislation, including, of course, establishing the 27th of Nisan as Yom HaShoah HaGevurah. The day the legislation was adopted in April 1951, Rabbi Nurak gave a speech in the Knesset that had some of the audience in tears, linking the Warsaw Ghetto uprising to another tragedy of Jewish history, As he explained, quote, "We had to choose a date that also fits most massacres of European Jewry, and the Ghetto Revolt took place in Nisan. That is why the Knesset Committee chose the end of Nisan, when many sacred communities were killed by the Crusaders, forefathers of the Nazis." That could have been that. Yom HaShoah HaGevurah, established 27th of Nisan, April 19th, done. But that wasn't the end of the story. Because even after the Knesset made it official, Israelis mostly treated Yom HaShoah HaGevurah like any other day. So in 1959, Rabbi Nurok and other survivors proposed another legislation to emphasize the solemnity of the day. By the 1960s, the day had taken its final form. All places of entertainment would be closed. The National Holocaust Museum Yad Vashem would help organize and broadcast public commemorations. And of course, for 2 minutes, the piercing wail of the air raid siren would remind everyone to pause, bow their heads, and remember. By this point, the Israeli conception of the Holocaust had matured. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, chief architect of the final solution, had captivated the world. For the first time, survivors were asked to lay bare their most traumatic memories. They spoke fluidly of the horrors they had endured, and they made it clear that resistance took many, many forms. No, they and their relatives had not gone quietly like sheep to the slaughter. Simply standing in that courtroom facing the man who had designed the bureaucratic machinery of death was a form of resistance too. But the story of Yom HaShoah HaGevurah doesn't end there. Though most Israelis accepted the 27th of Nisan as the official date, many Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox, hate that word. Communities believe that Nisan, the time of our national liberation and birth as a people, is an inappropriate time to commemorate the Holocaust, as I mentioned before. Instead, they choose to commemorate the Holocaust on the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, the traditional Jewish day of mourning. And they had some unlikely supporters. In 1977, Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who had lost his entire immediate family in the Holocaust, advocated for changing the date from the 27th of Nisan to the 9th of Av. He argued that there could only be so many days of mourning on the Jewish calendar, and that rolling Yom HaShoah into Tisha B'Av would help the Jewish people connect to both ancient and modern tragedies. Many prominent rabbis agreed with him, not just the Haredim, including both of Israel's chief rabbis, Chacham Ovadia Yosef and Rabbi Shlomo Goren, as well as Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, considered the father of modern Orthodoxy in the United States. But even these illustrious names couldn't convince the public or the Knesset to change the date, because others argued, persuasively in my opinion, that Yom HaShoah had to stay put in Nisan. After all, in springtime, kids are still in school, and the day becomes a valuable opportunity to teach the next generation about the Holocaust. Tisha B'Av, in contrast, is in the summer, when school is out. They worried about the pedagogical implications of changing the date, and ultimately they won the day, at least among Israeli politicians. Many of Israel's Haredi communities, however, continued to hold out. In the year 2000, Yisrael Spiegel wrote an op-ed in the Haredi newspaper defending the community's decision to ignore the 27th of Nisan. He asked, quote, "Who made the greater contribution to the rehabilitation of the Jewish people? Those who legislated a, quote, Memorial Day and arranged ceremonies, built museums and monuments, or those, meaning Haredi Jews, who simply restocked the ranks and through amazing personal sacrifice with no selfish considerations did everything to improve the state of Israel's demographic situation in order to reinstate as far as possible that which was lost?" In other words, he's setting up a pretty, I think, uncomfortable binary between Haredim and non-Haredim, arguing that Haredi families have responded to the Holocaust in the most effective way possible, that they don't build monuments or designate days of mourning. Instead, they have large Jewish families, a demographic middle finger to anyone who tries to erase the Jewish people. And I think that demographic middle finger is a wonderful thing. But I think it's an unnecessary binary. To me, it's a yes and. Every Jew and non-Jew has to grapple with the Holocaust in their own way. Monuments, museums, moments of silence, having more kids. If you are Jewish, investing in Jewish education. And for all of us, investing in education, reading books, hosting a podcast, bowing your head during the siren. All of these are valid expressions of memory and grief. We don't have to choose between one or the other. Unfortunately, the world keeps supplying fresh tragedies, and the Jewish people respond with untapped wellsprings of resilience. So that's the story behind Yom HaShoah HaGevurah and its connection to Israel. These are your 5 fast facts, but wait for the enduring understanding. Number 1, Yom HaShoah HaGevurah, Holocaust and Heroism Day, is the official Holocaust Remembrance Day of the State of Israel and is widely commemorated by Jewish communities around the world. Number 2, Yom HaShoah falls on the 27th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan in the spring, right between the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and Israeli Independence Day. Number trace. The link between the uprising and Independence Day is no accident. It's a symbolic reminder that the Warsaw Ghetto fighters and the state of Israel had the same goal, and that the state will pour every resource into ensuring that Jewish people have a refuge. Number 4, some religious Jewish communities prefer to commemorate the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av rather than the 27th of Nisan, linking the Holocaust to a chain of ancient tragedies. And number 5, Jewish days of mourning continue to take on new resonance with each tragedy, but at their core, these days are not solely devoted to mourning. They also symbolize resilience, because thousands of years later, we are still here to remember. Those are your 5 fast facts, but here's one enduring lesson as I see it. I know I just dedicated an entire episode to the Holocaust, rightfully. The Holocaust is important, like really important. But there are 2 aspects of Holocaust education that really grind my gears. The first is the all-consuming emphasis on this tragedy. So many Jews understand their Judaism through the lens of Nazis and ghettos and death camps. And those things are incredibly important moments in our history, but they are not the whole story. And if this is all you know about your Judaism, you are missing out on what Judaism is really about. This is not a new idea, of course. Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory reflected on this more than 40 years ago in an essay titled Auschwitz or Sinai, in which he argues that while it's critical to remember Auschwitz, we can't understand our Judaism through the negatives. Instead, we have to see our Judaism as a continuation of the covenant we made at Sinai so many thousands of years ago. Or as he puts it, quote, Auschwitz, like all Jewish suffering of the past, must be absorbed and understood within the normative framework of Sinai. We will mourn forever because of the memory of Auschwitz. We will build a healthy new society because of the memory of Sinai. I couldn't agree more. But how? How do you do this? How do you remember what happened to you without getting bogged down in your victimhood? How do you honor both Auschwitz and Sinai? I thought about this question endlessly for 7 years, because for 7 years, Razy and I took our students to Poland and Israel to learn about the Holocaust. And for 7 years, we watched our students struggle. I watched them cry and throw up and grapple with the question of evil. Where was God, they asked me. Why did this happen? Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, who, by the way, is the most fascinating guy ever, had an answer to this question that I always loved. He himself had served as a rabbi in Berlin during the early years of the Nazis, moving to England in 1940. The inferno could have swallowed him too, and unsurprisingly, much of his work is very concerned with the theology of the Holocaust. His answer to where was God during this time was, where was man? That was the key to reaching my students. Let me explain. For 7 years, Razy and I tried to change the narrative. We started by rebranding the trip. It was no longer the Poland trip or, oh man, even worse, the Auschwitz trip. Instead, we called it the Poland-Israel experience. And we meant it. We wanted it to be an experience, an opportunity for students to grapple with Auschwitz and realize it doesn't cancel out Sinai. We wanted them to remember that there is joy and agency and pride in being Jewish, that the story isn't just one of victimhood. And the most powerful expression of this came at the monument of 18 Mila Street, dedicated to Mordechai and Levitch. We told them the story of the uprising. We told them the story of this 24-year-old, just a few years older than them, and his band of malnourished and determined teenagers who refused to die quietly, who didn't flinch when death knocked at their door, who instead ran out to meet it, guns firing. And I would watch my students' faces change. From anguish to curiosity to a kind of glowing pride. Where was God? That didn't matter as much. Where was man? Man was right here, resistance, fighting, proud and unbroken, heroic. This too is the covenant we forged at Sinai, the deep meaning that gave the Warsaw Ghetto fighters such bravery and resolve. And that is the story of the Jewish people that every student in this country should know. Not just the story of Auschwitz or the Holocaust, but the story of the Jewish people's resilience. That's the duality of Judaism, of the Jewish state, of the Jewish story writ large. I am in awe of that sweet lady at the health insurance company who marched into her son's school to berate the principal. I am so touched and warmed by her insistence on teaching history, on knowing the truth, on her resistance. But if I could tell her and the principal anything, it would be this. The Jewish people are bigger than Auschwitz. When the Jewish people commemorate the tragedy of the Holocaust, we also commemorate the heroism of its victims and survivors. The Jewish people are not defined by what was done to them, but what they themselves do. That is both a massive responsibility and an incredible opportunity, and all of us have the power to decide how to meet it. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Adi Elbaz, Yael Frolich, Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.